Hi, welcome to another episode of Making Better Strategy. If this is the first time you're here, Making Better Strategy is a series of LinkedIn Lives, webinars, interviews, podcasts, and YouTube videos helping CEOs to make better strategy. If you don't know me yet, my name is Dr. Mark Snukus. I've been a strategy advisor for some 21, 22 years now, helping CEOs and their executive teams to develop, implement better winning strategies. And today we're going to talk about better strategy execution, or how to activate your strategy within your organization. Now, before we go there, I'm inviting you to just put in all the questions that you have into the chat. If you have any questions, feedback, comments, just put them there. We are supposed to be quite a lot of people today, so I'm not sure. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to answer all of them here live, but I'll make my very best to answer everything that's on LinkedIn. And if there are recurring topics, I'm happy to do another LinkedIn Live or webinar on that particular topic. Now, before I talk about strategy execution, I'd just like you to give you a little bit of context of how I think about strategy, because this is going to frame the discussion that we'll be having later on a little bit more. So what you see here on the slide, old school strategy, that's really how many companies think and do strategy at the moment. So when they talk about strategy, what they're really talking about is having financial targets, often lofty vision statements. They might have 3 to 5 year plans. It's a lot about benchmarking, best practices, following often what competitors are doing. Usually strategy is done once a year, maybe at a fancy offsite. There is this idea of think, then do. So first you can actually implement, or you can develop your strategy, and then afterwards you need to implement it. Very often we're working behind closed boardroom doors. There's lots of analytics and PowerPoint, and very often also strategy is outsourced either to external consultants who do the strategy, but very often also to internal consultants or internal strategy offices. Now, I've seen all of that happen in real life, and maybe so have you. If this rings a bell, if this resonates, then please leave me a message or a comment also on LinkedIn. And lots of companies and lots of executives are increasingly frustrated with how their organizations do strategy, because they think that, well, it can't work, or it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't give us the results we need, and we need to change our approach. Which brings me to the new rules of better strategy, as I call it here. So here it's about focusing on your most critical challenges and highest value opportunities, which can be addressed in the next couple of months. So it's not about, well, I'm not saying that you shouldn't think about your long-term vision, but you should focus on what can be done today. It's about putting innovation back into strategy. It's about going away from this once a year to something that is always on. So think while you're doing and involving stakeholders actually in conversations, instead of having all these KPIs and PowerPoint documents and so on. And we'll talk a lot about this today. So always on, think while you're doing, involving stakeholders. I talk about what that means and how you actually can do that. And at the end of the day, it's really about leadership, leaders taking responsibility and taking ownership again for strategy work instead of outsourcing it. So that's for a little bit of context. Now, in terms of really practically how I approach strategy, how I do it, it's these 3 types of activities, I would call it. So first, I mean, you have to make sense of what's going on. So think about your industry, what's going on in your market, what's going on in your organization, what's actually going on with your strategy, what's working, what is not working, before you then go into designing your strategy. And here you see the dimensions of the playing to win strategy cascade, which I like using a lot, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. To design your strategy, to define your strategy, if you like, and then you go into activating your strategy, actually making it happen. Now, this is not rocket science, probably also not something very new. I think on a high level of abstraction, strategy is always about analysis, development, implementation. What changes here is that it's becoming more iterative instead of being very sequential. And what you also see is these 3 black circles in the middle, which they represent the connection from one type of activity to another one, which often in real life I see missing. So much just to give you a little bit of context about how I think about strategy. Now let's dive into this activating your strategy part. And I would actually like to start with asking you, so if you think about strategy execution, what are your biggest challenges? So let me have a look at the comments. There's a little bit of a time lag here on LinkedIn, so I'll give you a couple of moments to start putting your questions or your challenges that you see with strategy execution into the comments, and I'll make sure to get back to them. Now, while you're typing away, so we have resistance from the organization as an example. Question is why is there resistance? That's a very good one, Arsham, that we're going to be talking about. Staying in the old behavioral patterns, so we don't change our behavior. That's also something we want to talk about. Unclear goal, communication, culture, people too busy. Chris, that's a good one. We often hear that we don't have time for strategy. Evaluating current customer experience, high-level plan that exists only on paper. So many coming so quickly. Failure to think big. Short-term thinking, alignment, prioritization, very good one. Ownership, resources, anchoring the strategy. Lisa, so what does that mean, anchoring the strategy? Lack of previous records, I feel insecure, Hiring strategy, so that's a very, very specific strategy, I would say. Making sure all components are in sync, and then the question is, what are the components that we actually talking about? Different perspectives and interests, transparency, fast-changing environment, lack of clarity. Very good. So we'll talk about all these things. Now, in my experience, the biggest challenge is actually this. We have a gap, a perceived gap between you've got strategy on one side and you have daily business on the other side. And as I think Chris actually mentioned, there is a perceived strategy is always perceived as something on top. We don't have time for strategy. We're so busy with our daily work, right? Strategy is always seen as something extra, an extra effort that comes on top of whatever we are doing. And obviously, ideally, strategy is your daily business. And I mean that in kind of two ways. So one way, strategy should be your daily business. And on the other hand, whatever you are doing is your strategy, right? So even if that does not really fit what you have put on paper as your strategy, the activities your organization engages in every day, the customers it's talking to, the products and services it's developing and selling, that is actually your strategy, whether it's intended or not, right? So ideally, we want to close that gap between strategy and daily business. Now, obviously, the question is, how do we do that, and how do we overcome all the challenges that you mentioned in the chat? And my key idea here is that, or my experience also is that instead of focusing too much on a roadmap, we should focus more on certain principles for activating strategy. What I mean by that is that very often when organizations implement a strategy or they want to execute a strategy, they have a clear roadmap. Very often, in the worst case, that roadmap is just a bunch of financial objectives, maybe broken down by year for the next 3 to 5 years, and then quarter, even monthly financial objectives that you are supposed to achieve. In the best case, it's just a laundry list of activities and to-dos and tasks that you want to engage in. And then, as somebody mentioned, it's really about sticking to the plan. And if it doesn't work, you still try to hold on and stick to the plan. Right? And as we know, things can change, environment can change, customer behavior changes, competitors change. So it's really about how can you then actually make that happen if the plan maybe doesn't work. So, and I propose to think and focus on a set of key principles to make strategy actually happen. And these 7 principles, we see them here, and we're going to go through them step by step, one after the other. Now, the first thing is kind of maybe a paradox, but execution becomes before development. What I actually mean by that is that you should think about execution before you even start developing your strategy. So you need to start involving actually people in the strategy exercise, and once you start developing the strategy, and not just after the strategy has been developed for implementation. Every change management theory will tell you that if you want people to be committed, if you want people to buy into your strategy or any type of change, you should involve them into the change in the first place. So that's what I mean by before and after. So involve people before you start, and not only after your strategy has been developed. Which brings me to this third bullet there, which is think while doing instead of think then do. So I would invite you to stop thinking about strategy as there is development first and then there is execution. Yes, at some point you need to start, so there will be some development, but after that first kind of iteration or that first kind of round of development, you should go into a continuous and iterative cycle of developing, thinking about it, doing it, reviewing it, and we're going to come to what that means. Right? And all of that actually will require you to be more open in your whole strategy approach and your strategy process. So open up the process, open up the strategy content, instead of being closed behind boardroom doors, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the question of how can you involve your organization in the strategy process, and when should you do so? Now, involving your organization in the strategy process is not about asking everybody, what should my strategy be, right? That's really not the purpose, and most people would be overwhelmed if you did that anyhow. So how can you involve the people in your organization? So the first thing, or the first step, could be request input on most critical challenges and highest value opportunities. So if you stick to that concept of strategy as solving your most critical challenges and seizing your highest value opportunities, why not ask the organization what these are? Then it doesn't mean that you should do all of them. Again, it's leadership task in this case to say, here are the challenges and here are the opportunities that we should think about, that we should focus on, and why. Once you have defined those, you can get ideas and solutions, again, from the organizations or from relevant stakeholders on how to address the challenges and how to seize the opportunities. Once you have the strategy, something that I like doing is we have a first version of the strategy, we call it draft, and then we invite stakeholders, we invite the organization to give feedback. So we ask them, what do you like? What don't you like? What are the challenges maybe that you see? What will be important with implementation? What are maybe concerns that you have about implementation? Which brings me to the fourth bullet there, inquire about crucial aspects for successful implementation. So we invite the organization into answering all these questions, so they get a feeling of ownership and they actually contribute to shaping the strategy. And I've seen many times that we did this. We got new information, we got new insights, we got valuable feedback, which made leadership actually maybe change the strategy here and there, but certainly fine-tune the strategy in certain elements so that it becomes clearer, so that the logic behind it is clearer, and that the organization feels more confident about implementing. Then, once you go into implementation, I would also recommend that as a leadership team, you don't define everything to the latest, to the detail, to the latest detail, but you provide more the directions, you provide the priorities, you explain what the organization should be focusing on and why, what is your logic behind it, and then you let the organization co-create the details on how to do it. So just now, I'm working with a healthcare organization where we have defined the priorities, and then we formed cross-functional teams that are in charge of implementing these initiatives and going to the details of how they want to do it, with some support, and I'm also going to come to that. And then finally, with this idea of continuously making strategy continuous, always on kind of thing, it's about involving everybody in reviewing the strategy and its progress. And what I mean by that, again, I'm going to come a little bit later to the details of how to review progress and evaluate it. Now, aligning your strategy to the rest of the organization or the activities in the organization is the second point. So if you want to implement your strategy, you need to think about how to align the activities throughout your organization to the overall strategy. And this is really about closing that gap between what we do in our daily business and the strategy. And what I'm talking about here is, traditionally, we used to call that the cascade. So idea of you cascade the strategy down through your organization. Now, Cascade is a little bit difficult, I find, because very often Cascade, at the end of the day, is nothing else than cascading objectives. I know an organization, it's a small organization with some 100 people, and they took 12 months, so a full year, on developing an OKR system for the entire organization. So really starting at the top and then breaking down OKRs into every part of the organization, every function, every department, every team. Now, obviously, crazy amount of work, and just by setting these objectives doesn't really mean that the organization is actually going to act in favor of your new strategy, which brings me to the activities. So I think, and in my experience, the most important thing you need to align on, or what you need to align, is activities. Objectives are also interesting and important. Resources, yeah, indirectly, but very often what we do is, if we talk about allocating resources, we're talking about allocating financials. But just by allocating a certain budget to the innovation is a popular topic where everybody says we're going to increase the budget because it's so important. But just by allocating more budget to innovation doesn't actually mean that innovation is actually going to, whatever the innovation team does is going to align with your strategy. So that's why I say you should focus on the activities that you are carrying out. And to do that kind of alignment, I use a variation of the playing to win strategy cascade. So as I said earlier, I like using the playing to win strategy cascade on the high level, on the business level, business strategy, and then we use a variation of that so that teams can adjust or define their strategy for their department, team, or function. And we start with what is your ambition? So obviously it's about defining the objectives that you have as a team. Then where to play, we focus on stakeholders. So that could be internal or external customers, and who are you prioritizing there? Who do you want to focus on? What products and services, internally you're also offering products and services, what products and services do you want to offer these customers? And most importantly, what activities do you want to focus on? So to give you an example, what we do here is we just make a list of, let's say you have an HR department, and let's say on a business level strategy, talent retention is a key priority. It's one of the strategic topics that one of the challenges that the organization wants to focus on. Now, what we would do in an HR department to align the strategy, we would obviously think about who are the stakeholders, what are we offering them, and then think about all the activities. So we make a list of all the activities that the HR department is engaged in a week or in a month. We look at how many people work on these activities, and we look at how much time do they actually spend on these activities in a typical week or a typical month. And then we try to adjust that to what is actually required in the strategy. So if, for example, as I said, strategic priority is talent retention. Lots of organizations, they struggle with finding talent. So recruiting new talent is becoming more challenging. So the better strategy might be to focus on the talent that you have and do talent retention. Now, if HR actually does this list of everything they are working on, maybe they see that they are working on talent recruitment a lot. Maybe 50% of their time is spent on talent recruitment. So instead of focusing on talent recruitment, you might need to shift the activities to talent retention. Let's say nowadays you're doing 10% on talent retention. You might want to shift that to talent retention a little bit more. So next one is how will we add value? So here it's really about what's the value proposition that you're offering your stakeholders, and how will you add value to the company? So traditionally we talk here about how will we win, which I think in this case is less relevant. And then capabilities and management systems is like on the playing to win strategy cascade. So it's a lot about what are the capabilities we need to be able to do this, and what are the management systems we need to implement that. Sorry, I was a little bit confused there. I just got another timer here, but I think just my LinkedIn restarted, so don't worry about that. Good. Next step. Once you have done the alignment, or part of the alignment is you need to prioritize strategic initiatives. Now, and you need to think about what actually can be done as business as usual, and where do you need strategic initiatives. Now, my preference would always be, if you try to implement a strategy, try to think about what can be done in the existing processes, structures, routines of the organization and try to stick to that as much as possible. Right? But sometimes it doesn't work because you don't have the capabilities. It's something new that you cannot do in the business as usual. So that's when you should do strategic initiatives. So here we're talking about maybe transformation of processes, structures, systems, and so on and so forth. And very important also, the transformation of ways of working. But again, strategic initiatives should be the exception instead of the rule, so to say. Now, when you have these strategic initiatives, how do you prioritize them? And I have two approaches that I like to use a lot. One is what I call the 4 types of strategic moves. So it's really about how clear is the challenge or the opportunity, and how clear is the move that we should be putting in place. If both are clear, it's execute. So you just go ahead and you do it. If the challenge is clear but the move is unclear, you might need to experiment. If the challenge is unclear and the move is unclear, it's about understanding more what the challenge or that opportunity looks like. So it's more about exploring. And might sound a little ridiculous, but sometimes you have moves that are clear, but it's unclear what kind of problem they will actually solve. So this is really very often pet projects, and my recommendation would be to eliminate these things. Another way to look at it is what I call here the strategy triage. So this is really about thinking about, does it impact whatever challenge you have? Is it a challenge for the entire organization or just a department or a team? And does it actually threaten the survival of your entire organization? So to give you an example, if you have a working capital problem, it might be more about really threatening the survival of your company because you're running out of cash. And that's something that is impacting more parts of the organization. So you might have finance, you might have sales, you might have production involved, purchasing involved in that. So it's more entire organization and it threatens the survival. If, on the other hand, you have an idea for a new system in finance so that finance can move from doing Excel reports to a more sophisticated way of doing reports that might just be a part of the organization, and it's not really threatening the survival. So in this case, you should focus more on the things that threaten the survival of the organization. Next, we have enable and support. So what I mean here is, how are you going to support strategy execution? So very often we communicate the strategy and then kind of the expectation is that the entire organization will just do it, whether they have the capabilities or not, whether they have the skills or not. So maybe sometimes we need to support strategy execution. And here, support really means enablement. So enable people to do the strategy, execute the strategy. It's not done for you, and it's also not about controlling. Sometimes you need to support the strategy development and execution within functions, departments, or teams. Sometimes you need to support strategic initiatives and so on. So again, with a client recently, they had a PMO, they had a quality team, they had a continuous improvement team. We put all of that together into a strategy support team. And these people now, they work with the different functions, departments to develop their strategies, to execute their strategies. And in this case, we also have a couple of strategic initiatives that they are supporting. Now, once you do all of that, at some point, you will need to evaluate whether things are working, whether your strategy is actually working. And again, thinking about evaluation, the principle is more to have strategic conversations. It's less about tracking KPIs, and it's about feedback and learning, and less about controlling whether everybody does what they are supposed to do. And very often when we're talking about evaluation, I mean, the core question is your strategy working or not? And the reasons why your strategy might not be working are, for me, this ARIS or ARIS. So first of all, it's action. So the question is, are we actually doing what we committed to doing? Is it we committed to certain actions? Are we doing that? Are we aligning the activities throughout our organization to the strategy? Second thing is results. So is the strategy really working? So we are doing what we're supposed to do. Is it showing the results that we were hoping for? If not, very often maybe the assumptions need to be changed. So maybe you had some assumptions about customers, about competitors, about suppliers, and these assumptions are just not valid. So you need to adjust your strategy. Sometimes it's also about new things that are happening, which require you to adjust your strategy. So it could be new insights, ideas, new challenges, new opportunities coming up. And the final element is the spirit. So what is really the mood regarding strategy in your organization, and is everybody still on board? Is everybody still committed to it? So these are the 4 things that you can ask about. So is it happening? If not, why not? And what can we actually do about it? So this is where you go into that kind of iterative strategy development and implementation and execution simultaneously, right? And to do all of that, you need leadership to take ownership, as I said earlier. So it's not about outsourcing this to a team or a bunch of consultants, but leaders should take ownership of managing, steering, updating the strategy, which means that you engage in these strategic conversations, and you try to direct and focus the organization on the priorities and the challenges that you have picked. You provide direction, you give guidance in terms of what are the outcomes that you want to see, but you let the teams actually do it for themselves. And you can also work on transforming the conditions. So what is happening, what is keeping teams from actually moving towards the strategy, from implementing the strategy, and you need to transform these conditions. And then, as I said, it's really about engaging in conversations with leaders, other people throughout the organization, really talking to them about what is their strategy for contributing to the strategy, if you like. How are you contributing to the strategy? What's keeping you from doing it? And how can I help as a leader? What can I do? What kind of barriers can I remove? Now, all of this, I said, we focus on principles. Now, very often, I know that leaders like to have a roadmap. So here is a typical example of something I call a strategy activation architecture. So you have these elements that I was talking about, the steering, you have the initiatives in this case, you have a support team here, you have the alignment where we do that strategy cascade, so aligning the various department strategies. You had some, in this case, we had a stream about culture and communication, so really involving the entire organization. And on the bottom, you see a stream about evaluation, where here we focus on an NPS. So we had an employee NPS, a customer NPS, and a supplier partner NPS, actually. And we try to bring all of these together. Now, the difference of this architecture to a conventional roadmap, like you might be thinking about it, is that here you don't really see tasks. So it's not about deadlines and stuff that must be done until a certain month or a certain quarter. But this is really an architecture with all the different meetings, workshops, opportunities we actually have for strategic conversations. So you see, for example, here on the monitoring on the bottom, we have a sounding board. So it's really about having a conversation about what is the spirit on the strategy throughout the organization. So think about this not as an implementation roadmap, really, but it's about orchestrating all these strategic conversations. So, and all of this, as I alluded to already at the beginning, only works if you open up your strategy. And by opening up your strategy, I mean 3 things. So you open up the process, involve the organization into the entire process. You open up the content. So you are transparent about what your strategy is, the why and the what. And it's also about open-ended kind of process. So this idea of it's not something you do once a year and then you go back to it next year and you look at what happened, but you make strategy an always-on process, which means that you kind of keep on going through these 3 activities. So if you, as I said, you start somewhere, you need to start with making sense, for example, but then you go into designing your strategy, you go into activating your strategy, and then through the strategic conversations that you're having, you're starting the strategy review, you see new things, you learn new things that happen in the industry, the market, the organization, and with your strategy. You use that again to adjust your strategy, and obviously you keep on activating your strategy. So you automatically kind of come into this ongoing cycle of doing strategy, of practicing strategy. And by doing that, you go through these iterative cycles of making sense, making decisions, and taking action, as I said here. And over time, obviously, your strategy will become more and more successful, and your strategy will become more and more mature as you go through these cycles. Which also helps to address another key challenge that I see a lot in strategy execution, and that some of you alluded to in the comments, is this idea of this tension between we have a plan that we think we need to follow, but stuff happens and we need to adapt to the things that happen in our environment. So by doing this continuous iterative way of working on your strategy, you are actually solving this challenge, because you're open to new insights that emerge, and you can at least think about, is it necessary to adopt our strategy to these new things or not? Now, a bonus tip on how to successfully activate your strategy is that it actually starts with having a good strategy. So you need to articulate your strategy. Very often people say, we have a strategy, we need to execute it, but the only thing they actually have is, as I said earlier, a bunch of financial targets, which is not really a strategy. Or they might have a plan, but it's not really a strategy. So you need to articulate your strategy. And for that, I mean, you can use here's a strategy alignment. This number is actually from research that has been published in Harvard Business Review, which says that only 23% of people in an organization are aligned on strategy. So what they actually did is they asked people throughout the organization to write down what is our strategy, and they think that, or they saw in the results that only 23% are actually aligned on what your strategy is. It's a shocking number, right? And actually leaders would always answer, well, we think it's 80%, but at the end of the day, it was only 23%. So if you want to increase that number, you need to articulate your strategy. You can use something like the strategy cascade, the playing to win cascade. You can use some organizations like using the Hambrick strategy diamond. That's all fine. Just pick one and stick with that. At the end of the day, they all talk about similar, very similar concepts. They use different words, like what is called here where to play. The Frederick Hambrick strategy diamond talks about arenas, about how to win or how will we win. The diamond talks about what's our differentiator, how are we going to make money, what's our economic logic. So the concepts are the same, just the wording is slightly different. So you use something like this to clearly express what is your strategy, and you want to make sure that it's not bad strategy. So nothing that's too fluffy, that fails to face the challenge, that's only financial goals, and so on and so forth. And if you'd like to learn more about what is good strategy, I'll come to that in a minute. Good. So that was a lot of me talking, and let me quickly have a look at your questions, and if you have any other questions that I need to go through. I saw a couple of questions around, will we get the presentation? I'm not sure, actually, to be honest. So there is the recording here for the slides. If you'd like to have the slides, just DM me on LinkedIn, and we'll see how I can make the PDF then available to you. Let's see, what other questions do we have? If you have any others, just put them into the comments. There was a question around, do OKRs suck or something like that? No, that's not what I'm saying. So I think OKRs can be very helpful. What I think is a waste of time and effort is if you take 12 months to define OKRs, a really cascade of OKRs, a hierarchy of OKRs throughout the entire organization. I really think that that's not really worth the effort, right? So I think that OKRs as a tool are good, but as with any tool, it's a question of how you actually use it, right? Strategy must accommodate culture in a way. I believe that makes implementation actually easy. Yeah, so strategy, there's two sides to that. So obviously you should think about the capabilities and the culture you have, and what is kind of compatible with the strategy. But at the same time, sometimes you have ambitions that go beyond your current organization and your current culture, and then it's also a matter of changing your culture. I think that culture eats strategy for breakfast. This famous quote that Drucker apparently never said, so nobody knows exactly where it comes from. Yeah, culture can help to implement a strategy, but it can also be, if it's a dysfunctional culture, it can keep you from implementing a perfectly good strategy. So that's also something that might need to be addressed. Right? Yeah, what I mean when I talk about organization, when I talk about any kind of organization, it could be a for-profit organization, it could be a non-profit organization, really. Different specific takeaway for a fintech organization. Well, specific takeaway, I guess, doesn't matter. In my mind, or in my experience, it doesn't really matter what kind of organization it is. Again, profit, non-profit, small, medium, large. It's really a matter of engaging in these conversations. And I think that even for SMBs, there's not a question about difference for SMBs and Fortune. For SMBs, I think you need even more of that strategic conversations and this iterative approach. And it's actually easier to do because you have a smaller number of people that you're engaging with. But it's a lot more practical also in that sense. I think in the Fortune 500, you probably have a strategy team who can prepare some input, who can structure the process, who can maybe facilitate some of the stuff that I was talking about. As the company becomes larger, you rely more on analytics. So that's why I think in an SMB environment, be more practical and be very pragmatic. So that's what I try always to do is we talk about these activities, and it's really about being pragmatic in terms of how you implement them. So don't overdo it. That's also famous. Lots of SMBs actually think that strategy is complicated and takes too much time and effort because they look at how Fortune 500s do it, but that's not necessarily how it needs to be done in an SMB. Right? And I think a lot of the resistance towards strategy in an SMB actually comes from that misconception that strategy has to be about long-term planning. Right? And I think with the 8 shifts that I showed before, it's not necessarily long-term planning, or that's just one view on how you can see strategy. Another question we have about how does the balanced scorecard fit in here? Well, you can use the balanced scorecard obviously for performance tracking, but again, don't make it an exercise of just tracking KPIs. Right? Make it an exercise of using the scorecard also to engage in conversations about, have we done everything we were supposed to do? Is it leading to the results that we have documented in the balanced scorecard that we would like to see or not? If not, why not? What is wrong? Assumptions we need to change, and so on and so forth. Right. So again, use that as a basis for your strategic conversations, and not necessarily as a controlling and carrot and stick kind of thing. Right. What other questions do we have? Let's see if there's, as I said, I promised to get back to them. Some stuff I'm not too familiar with the details of the fourth turnaround, so it's something I can't really talk about. Yeah, over engineering. Yeah, Abdul. So yeah, keep it practical, right? And what is practical always depends a little bit on the context, the size of the organization, and so on. But let's try to keep it as practical as possible, right? Alignment of the strategy, weekly, monthly, quarterly. Yeah. So again, it's a little bit what is necessary. Yeah? So when I work with a client, we tend to start with monthly review meetings where we have these conversations about, is it working, is it not working, why, etc. Some clients say, no, we'd like to do it weekly in the beginning, just to create some momentum and keep it. And once the maturity also of the organization in terms of doing strategy has become better, you might be able then to switch to a more quarterly kind of fashion of doing it. Yeah, Jacques-Antoine, so for representing simply clearly strategic activation plan, I would use something like that architecture that I showed. So that is something that I use to explain, okay, this is what we will be doing as a big high-level picture, and then we go into the details of what does that mean on every level. But that's kind of like the big level picture, right? Yeah. So Tom, yes. So it can also be done in the 12-week process to get started. So happy to talk about that in more detail. Good. How do you validate your strategy? Well, you need to implement it and see whether it works, right? So Roger Martin, for example, talks a lot about, everything that you put in your strategy, it's based on assumptions and hypotheses. And then the question is, how can you test them to make sure that your strategy is actually working? So I think strategy only exists in execution. So again, whatever you do, that is your strategy. So you need to execute and implement to see whether it is working or not. Yeah, Rick, about innovation becomes part of the strategy. So for me, that would be part of that, the yellow designing your strategy activities that I mentioned. And I actually have lots of material and ideas. One of the books here, Out of Opportunity, is only about bringing innovation strategy. So that's something that you need to be aware of. Yeah, same for David. So cognitive bias, groupthink. Again, I think that engaging in these strategic conversations, seeking feedback from a large number of people, avoids to a large extent that you have too much cognitive bias and groupthink in a small executive team who is thinking about strategy. So just by opening it up, well, I see that a lot of these things are, a lot of these biases and problems are actually mitigated, right? Yeah, so last question here about reviewing the strategy itself and make updates continuously. It's really, as I said, it's really a matter of doing it continuously. Obviously, you need to give a little bit of time initially to get to the activity, start doing it, but then you need to review continuously. And again, as I said, it's not just about reviewing the results that you get, but it's also about reviewing, are we actually doing what we said we do? Are the assumptions on which our strategy is based still valid? And is the spirit, the mood in the organization still aligned or convinced about the strategy? Or do we also need to adjust that a little bit? Good. So we are kind of approaching the end of our session. So if you have more questions, as I said, just put them into the chat here or put them into the comments. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. Now, if you'd like to learn a little bit more, here are a couple of things that you can do. So if you're ready to make better strategy, I have a program coming up, which is Better Strategy Intensive. So it's a 1 month program, like one session of 1 hour and 90 minutes, pretty much like we did here, but obviously more interactive, where you learn about my entire approach of doing strategy, from that making sense to the development to the activation, and with a lot more detail. So if you're interested in that, head over to activateyourstrategy.com, where you can find all the details and where you can actually apply for the program. If you want to work with me directly, then just feel free to send me an email. If you're just interested in more of my stuff, follow me on LinkedIn and visit me on snukers.com, my website, where you can find lots of free stuff. There's a free newsletter where every week I share one insight about making better strategy. There's free guides that you can download. There's free webinars you can watch, free YouTube videos, and so on. So a lot of stuff that you can also learn there. If you like this session, if you enjoyed it, then please leave a comment, give me some feedback. If you didn't like it, then also tell me what I can do better next time. And with that, so I hope that you enjoyed the session. I hope that it was valuable. Don't hesitate to reach out, and I wish you all the best with making better strategy in the future.